For this event, I'm delighted to introduce our distinguished guest, Suzanne Nossel. Suzanne is the CEO of the human rights organization PEN America and the author of the terrific book, Dare to Speak: Defending Free Speech for All. Prior to joining PEN America, Nossel served as the Chief Operating Officer of Human Rights Watch and as Executive Director of Amnesty International USA. She served in the Obama administration as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for International Organizations, leading US engagement in the UN and multilateral institutions on human rights issues. She's published in the New York Times, Washington Post, and the LA Times, among many other venues, and is a member of Meta's Oversight Board, an international body that oversees content moderation on social media. She's also a magna cum laude graduate of both Harvard College and Harvard Law School. And as a point of personal privilege, I would say that we have known each other since our undergraduate years. And so I am doubly thrilled to welcome Suzanne Nossel to NYU Law. For the end of today's program, I'll open up for Q&A. Please submit any questions you have through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to as many questions as we can. Welcome, Suzanne.
Thanks so much, Kenji. It's great to be here with you.
So I want to jump right in and set up the core tension that you seek to resolve in your book. So you write in the introduction, quote, "Those who care deeply about both free speech and equality find themselves pressed to take sides between vaunted principles that sometimes seem to conflict," close quote. Can you say more about this? Why do these principles seem to conflict with each other, even if, as you argue, they do not?
Yeah, sure. Well, thank you. I've been asked sort of often this question, and I've really tried to think about why it is that the drive for a more diverse, equitable, and inclusive society does seem to bump up against free speech, and particularly that those conflicts, there's a sense that they've intensified in recent years. And I think it kind of comes down, in my mind, to this, that in earlier stages of the civil rights movement, the women's rights movement, we were looking at formal equality, equality in wages and admissions to schools, in public accommodations. And, gradually those laws change. Now, of course, it's complicated, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. You can't say that that work is entirely finished, but even with all of the progress on those fronts and all of the advances, what we come to grips with is that there is this deep legacy of prejudice and exclusion and stereotyping on the basis of race, on the basis of gender, that remains, notwithstanding all of those formal changes, legal changes, and progress. And so I think kind of inevitably, when you try to get to that layer, what I think of as sort of the intractable, stubborn legacy of bigotry and exclusion, it implicates how people think and how they react emotionally, and what they say, what they hear. And so inevitably, I think the question arises, if you're trying to get at that deep layer, doesn't that necessarily implicate how we talk to each other, the messages that people hear? Isn't there a need to protect people from words and phrases that may compound their sense of marginalization, that they may find offensive, that they may view and react to as an affront to their identity? And so that's kind of why I think this phase of the struggle, if you will, has focused so much on these battles over speech.
Super helpful. So to just drill in a bit to the actual voiced concerns on both the left and the right, let's start with the left. The New York Times ran a story not long ago about the internal friction at the ACLU over whether that organization should continue its practice of defending the free speech rights of odious speakers like Nazis and white supremacists. So what do you say to the progressives who argue that the right of free speech needs to be tempered when that speech causes harm to marginalized groups?
Yeah, I mean, I first of all, one thing that I do that I think is a little bit unusual for a free speech defender is that I don't deny that speech can cause harm. And historically, I think in the defense of free speech, there's been a sense that if you acknowledge the notion that speech can cause harm, you're opening the door to censorship. And this is still kind of hotly debated. This kind of claims of harm are very much to this day contested territory. But I talk in the book about how particularly people who are on the receiving ends of slurs and stereotyping pervasively over time, they hear it again and again everywhere they go, that has real documented psychological, academic, even physiological consequences. And there's evidence of that's been studied. And so I think for a free speech defender, we're more credible if we acknowledge that those harms do exist, but we also recognize that those harms can be and are often exaggerated, projected, presumed. And so we have to interrogate the notion of harm and really ask ourselves whether, a fleeting slight or even an offense, something that's upsetting, that's unsettling, really is a source of lasting harm. And, as we go through life, harm happens. There are unsettling moments that happen, daily in the New York City subway system, that may make you feel a bit unsafe and a bit uneasy, that may stay with you. And so learning how to deal with a level of psychological sort of disturbance and that which is uncomfortable, I do think is part of daily life. It's necessary for all of us to build up a resiliency toward that. And I think that applies to these debates over speech as well. And the other thing that I emphasize is, I think what we really have to ask ourselves is, if we give someone the power to police speech on the grounds of trying to minimize offense and harm, how is that power going to be used? And what I find and argue in the book is that kind of, if you're giving that power, whether it's to the head of a company where you work, or whether it's to your government, there's a high potential that over time, that authority and that discretion is going to be used by that person in a position of power in ways that are self-serving, that it'll be used to suppress dissent, to reify their own prerogatives. So it may be in the moment that they punish somebody who you think deserves to be disciplined for what it is that they said, but you've then sort of afforded this power to police and punish speech. And once that power is afforded, it can be used in all sorts of different ways. And I give an example, the Springfield Police Department. So there was an officer in that department who tweeted out or posted on social media approvingly of what happened in Charlottesville, essentially in support of the protesters, and saying that the individual who lost her life that day sort of had it coming. And he was disciplined and removed from the force. And then fast forward a couple of years later, during the Black Lives Matter protest, there was another cop, a detective, who posted on her social media, she retweeted a poster saying that was critical of the police and taking the side of the Black Lives Matter protesters. And she was removed from the force, with the commanding officer saying, well, because it had happened in the earlier instance and someone was disciplined for a political post on social media, that same standard would apply, and she deserved to be disciplined as well. So it just sort of illustrates how it is that the power to punish can be exercised in ways that you don't necessarily predict, and that ultimately may come around to affect speech that you value.
Hmm. Yeah, well, following on that, taking the international perspective, you note in your book that many of our peer nations outlaw hate speech, including Australia, Canada, France, Norway, and the UK. In fact, you write, quote, virtually every democracy in the world allows greater government restraints on speech than does our First Amendment, close quote. So, these countries seem to be quite confident, right, that this boomerang effect will not occur, that they can sort of shut down hate speech or regulate hate speech without it having these knock-on consequences. So what gives you the sense that our country's really outlier approach with the First Amendment is better than the approach taken by these other nations?
Yeah, look, I mean, I don't argue that sort of Canada or the UK are repressive societies and that their system is one that denies all freedom of expression. I don't say that, but I think the question I ask is really whether that system is better when it comes to tamping down not just hateful speech, but hateful attitudes in society. And I look in the book at Germany, where they ban Holocaust denial. And you can understand why, as a historical matter, it makes a lot of sense. But during the period when I was writing the book, there was a big upsurge in anti-Semitic incidents here in the United States. And I was curious, what was happening in Germany during the same period? And, with their Holocaust denial laws, which are intended to protect against anti-Semitism, were they effective in reducing the levels? And what I saw was that the levels of increase in anti-Semitism, the surge was just about exactly the same in Germany as it was here. And so to me, the evidence that these laws, I think they're well intended, but that they act, whether they actually serve the goal of lessening the pervasiveness of hateful attitudes, I think is really debatable. And then the other piece is kind of inevitably these laws end up being applied kind of selectively. And this is something I dealt with when I was at the State Department. We were dealing with Muslim countries that were coming forward and seeking out a ban on content and messaging that they call defamation of religion. And this grew out of, if people remember, the Danish cartoon controversy of the early 2000s, where a Danish newspaper published a series of cartoons depicting the Muslim prophet Muhammad, and those depictions were considered deeply offensive, and the publication triggered protests and riots that turned deadly around the world. And then these countries kind of came together and they said, we have to do something about it. And the something was trying to seek out a global ban. And as the United States, we were working with our European allies and like-minded countries all over the world to push back and say, no, as a matter of free expression, we can't outlaw this sort of cartoon or paintings of the Prophet Muhammad or illustrations in a book. That would be a real infringement on freedom of expression. And actually, one of the most powerful arguments I had, they came back and said, well, in Europe and in much of the world, Holocaust denial is banned. And so you have those laws that protect Jews and that, encroach upon freedom of expression, delimit freedom of expression in the name of protecting Jews. So all we're asking for is, in effect, the same thing. We want, a comparable type of protection extended to us. And it was always a very powerful argument for me to be able to say, well, in the United States, we don't ban Holocaust denial. That speech is protected by the First Amendment. And so, we do take a more expansive view, and we're not going to agree to limiting free expression in the way that you're asking. And so, that, and then the many examples of how these laws sort of end up being twisted around. It's a law against hate speech, and then it's used to suppress, Palestinian protesters who are criticizing Israel. There's so many examples along those lines of what different groups of people may argue and say is perfectly legitimate political speech, but that in someone else's mind is hateful speech. And what that goes to is really the difficulty of doing this kind of line drawing. And it's something we deal with in the non-governmental context on the Meta Oversight Board. Where do you draw the line when it comes to incitement? Where do you draw the line on hate speech? Can you say, death to the supreme leader of Iran? Some people might say that's hate speech. You're calling for someone's death. In someone else's mind, that's an incredibly powerful and essential form of protest. And I think just on balance, we are better off not giving our government the authority to draw those lines and the ability to use the power of the state to ban and punish on the basis of them.
Yeah, you just used the words on balance. And, I have to say that one of the things that I truly admire about this book is, how measured and balanced it is, that you don't sort of, as you said earlier, sort of wave away, the harms or the existence of harms of speech. Nor do you actually sort of, say, the freedom to speech is absolute with regard to equality claims. So I now want to turn to the concerns raised more by the political right. So people on the right often argue that expecting folks to adhere to certain standards when speaking on topics of diversity, equity, and inclusion hampers their ability to speak freely. So you reject that notion in your book, arguing that, and here again, I quote, the conscientious use of language can enable everyone to speak more freely. Why is that?
I do think conscientiousness, being aware of who your audience is, of what the sensitivities and the fault lines are in a society, of how people like to describe themselves, of what may be offensive to someone else. I think that is part of good citizenship in a pluralistic society, and that these are things that we need to keep abreast of, that particularly those with powerful platforms, whether you're a professor at the front of a classroom, or you've got your own talk show, or you're writing for a magazine and you've got a megaphone, that you have a special duty of care to be attentive to how your words are going to land. You can't just assume, you're talking to people who have had the exact same life experiences you have had, who think the way that you do, who are going to respond in precisely the way that you might. So I do think that's just a necessary undertaking for all of us in order to be able to live together. That said, though, I do think it can go too far. I was reading a really interesting article last night that George Packer just published in The Atlantic about sort of guides to language, universities and organizations that are putting out these written guides, essentially long lists of words and phrases that you shouldn't say, and it's all kinds of things. I mean, some things that might be an out and out slur where you could easily agree. And then it's all sorts of phrasing, a brown bag lunch. You can't talk about, you can't say stand up for women's rights. You can't say, our supervisors were blind to just how much work they were putting on our plates. All sorts of phrases that are off limits. And, at Penn, we reject that. We don't believe in long, laundry lists of words that are out of bounds or forbidden. And I don't think conscientiousness equals that. I think, what I advocate is, if you're trying to approach things conscientiously, like, you may take, if you're wondering if something's offensive, you might look it up and Google it. You might see what people have said. You might, if you're writing about, say you're not from the disability community and you're writing about a story about something focused on that population, like, it may be a good idea to look and see, what terminology people from that community like to use, what is the guidance from organizations. But I think that it's really important that that be voluntary on the part of the speaker or the author, and that it not be imposed centrally in a top-down way. And for a couple of reasons. I mean, for one, I think people find it intrusive, and there is this sense that these clear fault lines are being drawn, and that regardless of the intent of the context, that you may be punished or called out for something that you say. And I think that inhibits expression and the free flow of ideas. George Packer also makes a really powerful argument about how these types of term sheets impair vivid and powerful language, that imagery and evocative descriptions really essentially can become off limits. And you've got to use this very anodyne, sort of bureaucratic speak to describe everything. And it just takes away from the power of language and even the power, conceivably of literature to inspire us, to spark the imagination. I think it's one thing if, it's an organizational statement, it's an employee handbook, maybe it would be a good idea to follow these kinds of parameters in that context. But the notion that, these guides should be operative for everybody in every context, I think is a real mistake. So I'm a believer in conscientiousness, but there's a difference between that and sort of rigid, go and no-go zones when it comes to language.
Good. And I don't mean this to sound, overly challenging, because I'm sort of right there with you, sort of struggling through these issues, as I think we all are. But I want to return to this idea of linguistic conscientiousness, which to me in itself sort of is worth the sale of the book, because I use this phrase now all the time, attributing you constantly. But as you define it, you describe the idea of linguistic conscientiousness to be akin to environmental conscientiousness, where you say, quote, littering or wastefulness simply comes to feel gratuitous and undesirable, right, close quote, right? So I really love that idea. Like, I could go out there and litter and probably no one's going to arrest me, but like, I've internalized over time that this is not an appropriate thing to do. And you exactly anticipated, I don't know the Packer citation, but we were going to ask you about Stanford University's website for the Elimination of Harmful Language Initiative, which I think has many of the kind of examples that you're talking about. They ask, folks to avoid terms like white paper, to avoid words like American. Then there was a backlash and Stanford took down the website, right? So I assume, based on what you've said, that you would be in favor of Stanford taking down the website. But I guess my follow-on question is, doesn't this idea of linguistic conscientiousness involve at least two issues, right? One is, doesn't it involve the same kinds of line drawing issues that you were trying to eschew earlier? And then I suppose the other thought is that when you said that a lot of autonomy should remain with the speaker, I wonder what that does with regard to your analogy to environmental conscientiousness, because even though, I could presumably litter on the street and then I might get arrested, but I probably wouldn't, right? I'm still, those norms are coming from somewhere, right? The norms that teach me to be environmentally conscientious come from a sort of broader society around me, right? So it's not just my decision, right, to do it or not do it. At some level, I'm being persuaded by a kind of infinite and infinitesimal set of conversations that I have with others, whether I know that I'm having them or not. So I wonder how you would sort of grapple with those two things. I would frame it as like the line drawing issue, and then the other one is pure autonomy in this space really possible.
Yeah, I mean, look, on the line drawing, I think I'm a big believer in sort of human agency and judgment. And that's kind of what I try to put at the center of the book, is the idea, the book is organized around 20 principles for how we can live together in our diverse, digitized, and divided society without curbing free speech. And one of the premises is so many of the issues that we debate right now in terms of free speech really don't implicate the courts or even legislatures. I mean, it's changing, and I'm sure we'll get to that in terms of what's happening in Florida and elsewhere around the country. But that actually was not happening even a couple of years ago when I first wrote the book. And so, my premise was that really this falls to us as citizens to take up the responsibility to defend free speech, to figure out how we can navigate these fault lines and live in very diverse, pluralistic communities without constantly tripping over one another, offending one another, being misunderstood. And so, to me, there's a big difference between urging people to think that way and take these considerations on board, and trying from the other side to, as a university or an employer, kind of dictate what can and can't be said. I actually don't think it's that different from the environmental arena, where a lot of the reason why we recycle or we don't litter, or we try to conserve, is that we know the consequences. We're concerned about what's happening to our planet, and we want to do our part and behave responsibly. And I think it's kind of the same thing. We know that we're living in a society that has these legacies of racism, of gender bias, of other forms of exclusion, and we want to do our part to try to mitigate that. And that's a voluntary decision. And, this is not Singapore where you can get fined for, dropping a piece of gum on the sidewalk. That's not how we do things. And nor do I think we should go in that direction when it comes to empowering authorities to police speech. But that doesn't mean that it's not important for each of us to consider our own obligations in this regard.
Beautiful, thank you. So you mentioned in talking about the Packard work that it could actually an overly kind of restrictive vision of speech could restrict literary art, right? So more recently, you commented on the decision by Publishing House Puffin to remove offensive language from Roald Dahl's children's books. And you wrote on Twitter, at PEN America, we're alarmed at news of hundreds of changes to venerated works by Roald Dahl in a purported effort to scrub the books of that which might offend someone. If we start down the path of trying to correct for perceived slights instead of allowing readers to receive and react to books as written, we risk distorting the work of great authors and clouding the essential lens that literature offers on society, close quote. Could you elaborate on this? Why did the publisher's decision alarm you?
Yeah, look, I don't exclude scope for any changes to literature. I don't think we should take an absolutist line on this, but when I looked at the breadth of the changes that they were proposing and tried to understand the motivations behind them, it was clear this was not like a surgical scalpel, meant to respond to a very direct kind of concern or objection that anybody had to these books. This was a kind of more full-throated effort to scrub the books up and down from anything that might conceivably be considered offensive. There's this reference, now this has been discussed a lot, but to witches who wear wigs, and then this line inserted, well, people wear wigs for all sorts of reasons and there's nothing wrong with that. They took out sort of horse face in the description of a character, and it really came to alarm me, that idea that you can look at all the books here in this office or behind you, and pick them up one by one and have some committee try to decide what in there is offensive, and never mind when it was written, the context in which it was written. I just think that's a dangerous path to go down for similar reasons to what we were talking about a moment ago when it comes to these lists of excluded terms, that we really can't kind of scrub our discourse clean of all offense. If we do so, I think we impair the literary value of these works. We also obscure the intention of the author, the historical moment in which these things were written. Roald Dahl kind of enthralled children in part because it was inappropriate and it was outlandish and outrageous, and the images were so evocative, and there were kids who were sort of distasteful and horrifying even. You felt a bit of revulsion just thinking about them, and that's actually the power of the work. So if you try to buff off those edges and turn it into something anodyne, it really ceases to be itself. And I think we have to recognize, whether it's comedy or literature, that it is by pushing these buttons and pushing out at the edges that these artistic forms gain their potency, that they force us to look at ourselves, think about how we react to things that are disturbing. They bring to light things that are difficult to talk about or articulate, where we might feel concerned about offending someone or how people would react. But in literature, the ideas that would otherwise be off limits can be explored. And I think it's really important to protect that zone for all of us. And it's gotten harder to do. And so, I was gratified when the publisher at least decided that they're going to keep the original classic Dahl works unedited, still in publication and in circulation. And what was interesting was also there was a lot of consensus about it. There were some dissenting voices, but a big chorus kind of right and left. I think there's certain reasons for that. It might have been more complicated if the changes were different, if they went right up against certain fault lines, say on issues of race that really weren't that implicated in these particular edits.
So you know where I have to go, which is like, is there a limit point to that? So the N-word in Huckleberry Finn, how would you treat that?
I think it should not be excised. I think when you teach it in class, you can contextualize it. And I've spoken to teachers who've done this, who sort of let people know that they understand that it's a notorious slur, that it has a lot of power, that it can be deeply offensive, but that it is in this book, and you're going to come across it, and we can talk about it. Be prepared. And I think when that's done, it can land in a way where people understand it in historical context. That doesn't mean it's okay. I think the suggestion is not, this is offensive now and it wasn't offensive then. It was offensive then. And it was perhaps just a question of people who were most offended not having much voice in the society, that the objections were not as audible and vociferous as they might be today. But I think, it goes back to the principle that if you're going to accept the notion that literature, even if it's offensive, must be protected, that you really have to apply that across the board. Now, do you have to say the word out loud in a classroom? I don't think necessarily so. I don't think that's required. I do think, I talk about in the book, I've thought a lot about how important it is to, particularly when it comes to that word, to really delve into what it means. And it means something very, I think, quite different to generations in schools and universities now than it did even when we were in school. At least people were not empowered to speak out. And so everybody, I think, should be on notice about that.
Right. So you mentioned earlier that you thought we would get to the legislation coming from the right, and we are now at that juncture. We're both lawyers, so let's roll up our sleeves here. So in Florida, the Stop Woke Act seeks to prohibit the teaching of so-called critical race theory concepts in schools and workplaces. And as you know, recent bill, House Bill 999, goes even further, such as by banning all diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives in state colleges. PEN America's statement on Florida's HB 999 calls it the most draconian and censorious restrictions on public colleges and universities in the country. Can you tell us more about why these legislative developments are so troubling?
Yeah, look, it's really alarming. I mean, Florida's become ground zero for the battle over free speech in this country. And I think what's happened in essence is that in the drive for a more equal, diverse, inclusive society, there is a perception in certain quarters that has gone too far, and that it's become kind of a rigid orthodoxy. One example would be the sorts of language guides that we were talking about a few minutes ago, but many other examples as well, that we've changed how history is taught. We've changed how we deal with pronouns. We've changed how we deal with bathrooms, and that to some people this is moving too far, too fast. It's an affront. It's an encroachment on what they're accustomed to, what they are comfortable with. And I think what Governor Ron DeSantis has done is sort of tapped into this deep vein of antipathy in certain quarters toward all of these changes. And he's used that as a justification for a frontal assault on our First Amendment freedoms, that I think, even if you believe that in some instances, the drive for equity and inclusion has kind of gone too far, or it's impinged upon free expression rights, the notion that the solution is legislation, with the force of law, dictating what can be taught in a classroom, what books can be on a shelf, what programs a university can offer, that is far worse than the disease. These are laws that are going to remain in force unless they're repealed. This is not just, somebody's idea of what to teach in a given semester. This is not just a fleeting Twitter mob. This is something far more formal and forceful. And he clearly has decided that this, at least for him, in the political quest that he's engaged in right now, that this is a winning formula, because he seems to double down just about every week with a new piece of legislation that takes it even further. And we're working with librarians, with teachers, with advocates on the ground in Florida to strengthen their hands. It's not a battle you can win from out of state or New York. It's really a question of norms and values within Florida, but to call this out for what it is, to challenge it in court, to mobilize people to stand up for their free expression rights. And what's ironic here is, until recently, people like DeSantis and the Republican Party have styled themselves as great free speech defenders. They were so upset by what they saw as encroachments on free speech coming from the left. And, they have just completely turned their backs on that and lost all credibility by embracing, tactics that really, we know we do a lot of work around the world at PEN America. And, the censorship of books, having media specialists have to review every book before it can be put on the shelf of a library in a classroom in Florida. That's reminiscent of what they do, in places like China and Iran. And so I find it very worrying that this is been embraced as a kind of tactic du jour, particularly by somebody who has national political aspirations.
Well, exactly. So he's doubling and tripling down on this. So he's laying a wager. If you were a wagering person, like, how do you think this all shakes out?
I think ultimately most, and the statistics confirm that across the political spectrum, Americans do not like book bans. They believe in the freedom to read. And so I think these measures ultimately are going to be rejected at the national level, but that doesn't mean they won't gain and retain significant traction in parts of the country. I think he's normalizing restrictions that have never really been tried, and there are copycat bills that are being adopted in state houses across the country. A bill in Tennessee just passed, basically outlawing drag shows, and it also sort of plays into the divisions in our country, because you see kind of the very same things being embraced in one part of the country and just abjectly rejected in another. But it does concern me, the idea that there are legislators and citizens who are coming to accept that these sorts of things can be outlawed, that can be within the power of government. And it's going to be a big question how courts react to this. But we know, with the direction that the courts have moved in recent years, and particularly at the Supreme Court level, that we can't just rest assured that these impingements on our First Amendment freedoms will be reversed. We really have to rise up and reject them as citizens.
One of the kind of themes that is often rehearsed by, DeSantis and his colleagues are the harms of cancel culture. And I find myself wondering where you stand on cancel culture, because we can see sort of speech on both sides of the equation, right? On the one hand, cancel culture seems like a form of classic free speech. People are just voicing their opinions in opposition to those who have said something that they don't like, right? On the other hand, cancel culture can lead to fear and self-censorship. So how would you analyze this issue?
Yeah, look, cancel culture is a term that's used very elastically. I think, at its essence, it's sort of a pervasive pattern whereby people use various forms of private power in order to punish speech. I'd say, for me, I think there are, there's a spectrum. And, when it comes to, some of the, for example, the Dilbert cartoonist who was canceled last week, I think, that actually, I think a lot of people felt his comments were so kind of over the top that, private newspapers were within their rights to decide that they no longer wanted to be associated with him. And even he seemed to, in his own reaction, kind of acknowledge that he had kind of gone beyond any defensible pale in just evincing kind of raw bigotry. So you have that on one side, and then you have other cases that are very different, where it's a fleeting offense, something unintentional. And I talk a lot in the book about the importance of assessing intent and context in evaluating the import of speech. I give a number of examples. A famous one is Shelley Sherrod, who was a employee of the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and she was talking about sort of denying aid to a white farmer, and her remarks in a speech were clipped and taken out of context and characterized as anti-white racism, and she was fired from her job. When the whole tape was reviewed, it was clear she was telling a story about how she had turned around and helped this white farmer, and they had become great friends, and President Obama had to apologize to her and to reinstate her. And so it's extremely important to take the intent and context into account, and before we respond reflexively to speech. And so that's where cancel culture can kind of get ahead of itself. And I'd say the aspects of sort of cancel culture that I find the most troubling, one is when it crosses over and calls for reprisals against speech. It's one thing to object to speech, to say, look, I disagree with that. I find that objectionable. I renounce that, condemn that even. But that's different from calling upon, whether it's the state or a private employer, to come back and punish the speech. I think when you do that, you really are pointing in the direction of increasing the power of those in positions of authority to ban and punish speech. And for reasons that we talked about earlier on, I think that's a risky kind of direction to go. And, you're right. A lot of cancel culture itself consists of constitutionally protected speech. People are voicing their viewpoints, and they need to have space for that. But there are also instances in which even that exercise of free speech rights, which should be protected, it shouldn't be punished, it itself can cross over into a kind of censoriousness. And I think that's just something we all need to be aware of when we're exercising our own power of speech. Are we actually trying to shut others down?
Thank you. So I bet a bunch of our audience are dying for me to get to the Meta Oversight Board. So what about tech companies is my next question. So I recently joined you on the Oversight Board for Meta. Has your experience on the board, to the extent you care to talk about it, changed your views about this balance between free speech and inclusion? Regardless of your answer to that, what should social media platforms generally be doing that they're not currently doing to promote both free speech and inclusion?
Yeah, it's really interesting because in the legal context, we have the First Amendment, we have, this very solid norm also in international law, even though it's not quite as extensive, limiting the power of government to police speech. And in the social media realm, there is no such limitation. And I think we're all basically in agreement that there shouldn't be, that we want content platforms like Meta, like Twitter, to be significantly more active in moderating content and trying to mitigate the harms of the platforms than we would ever allow government to be. And that's partly a function of the way that speech moves differently online than it did in the physical world. It can be weaponized. It moves algorithmically. Speech, to me, what I've learned about social media that's been so striking is that it really sort of weaponizes human nature. And if what you love are cats, it will feed you more and more and more about cats. If what you love are your group of friends or your college class of alumni, it will feed you more and more along those lines. And if what you're intrigued by is conspiracy theories or quackery when it comes to COVID-19, the very same. It jet fuels those interests, and really without much discrimination over whether they're benign or malign. And there are tweaks now that have been made to the algorithms to try to draw those distinctions, but by its very nature, algorithmically, it's really just a function of what you gravitate toward. And so what we've seen systematically is that, it turns out we really have a dark side as human beings, and that a lot of what we kind of traffic in, what intrigues us the most, what is compelling to us, what keeps us active and engaged is harmful and disturbing, and can also prompt real world actions that are violent or destructive. And so how we sort of tamp that down, and how far we want the platforms to go, and how you can develop rules that tamp down what's harmful while also enabling what is positive. I mean, one of the things you'll find now that you're on the board, and I'm sure it's going to start right away, is you'll be hearing from people who find your email address and write to you with these plaintive pleas about how their accounts have been taken down or their posts have been taken down, and that this is a lifeline for them, that they're isolated, and that social media is how they stay connected to the world. Maybe they have a disability, maybe they're earning a living via social media. And so there's almost a desperation to a lot of these pleas. And you see just how significant these platforms are in terms of people's ability to connect, to communicate, and how the policing of the platforms really does have a downside, and how difficult it can be to draw these kind of surgical lines between, what we might all agree is harmful and what we want to preserve.
Wonderful. Thank you. So I'm going to go to audience questions now. We have a bunch of good ones. So let me begin with this. I'm all for learning how to develop emotional resilience, even when challenged by offensive scenarios in daily life. But what about the fact that some portions of society are forced to endure such scenarios and spend resources developing their quote unquote emotional resilience more than others?
I think it's a valid point, and it's definitely true. And that's always been true. And there are all kinds of differences between people, whether it's socioeconomic or racial or gender, that, put additional burdens on some people that others don't have to face. And there are people who kind of glide through life very easily. And there are people who have an incredibly hard time. And, just honestly, I think that we can correct for that in certain ways as a society, and we try to, giving support to those who need it, but we can't correct for it completely. And I don't think in when it comes to free speech, that the effort to sort of correct for it, I think, can become very problematic. People love to talk about sort of punching down, and that, well, the one thing that they really can't accept, in terms of discourse or offensive speech is when someone punches down. But, it turns out it's a lot more complicated than that. I mean, when you have somebody who's in a position of power, perhaps, but then they're on the receiving end of just an avalanche of vitriol on social media that, maybe doesn't take the intent or the context of their comments into account, and, causes them to lose their job and destroys their reputation. There's power on both sides of that equation, and power can be amassed in the public arena. And sometimes it can happen very quickly and almost unthinkingly, without necessarily a lot of grounding in what the facts or the merits are. And so, I think we need to be realistic about the potential to equalize the differences that you're talking about. I think at the Meta Oversight Board, we spend a lot of time thinking about how various policies affect those with less power. For example, we just put out a big opinion on Meta's cross-check system, which is essentially a two-tiered system that has benefited their business partners and powerful and prominent people. And we said, look, if you're going to have a system like this, it needs to protect those who really need it: human rights defenders, journalists, people whose speech is of particular value and who are at the greatest danger of being repressed and silenced on the platform.
Yeah, this is in a similar vein of, if you took a particular post on social media and you found it inoffensive, but then you found that there were sort of 10,000 or 10 million like posts, in the same vein, would that change your calculus in thinking about the harms of the speech? It's a scale.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think it definitely does. It's a difficult question because, our law, for example, on harassment, looks at things like whether that harassment is pervasive or whether it interferes with your ability to have equal educational or employment opportunities. And, it doesn't really account for the decentralized nature of online speech, where you could feel very harassed because you've gotten sort of 10,000 oblique messages on Twitter, kind of questioning something you did, but every one of those questions individually, might be perfectly within bounds, but the volume of them has a very different effect. So you could have sort of someone harassed without there being necessarily a harasser. Now, it's also true that very often, when that kind of fervor builds up online, that, there are people who are behind it. There may be bots that are playing a role in it. It may be a deliberate, coordinated strategy. So it's not all as innocent necessarily as it looks, but I think that is a difficult question. And part of the answer that we focus on here at PEN America is how do we empower users to take more control and protect themselves against abuse? We focus on steps that the platforms can take to allow you to assert yourself, to shut things down, to dictate what you do and don't want to see, so that you're not suppressing the speech of others, but you are also not sitting unprotected as a victim.
Yeah, this follows. The questioner says, how do you protect people from hateful speech? So what would those measures look like? And then as a follow-on, do you believe in any form of punishment for offenders? Or is there another more rehabilitative approach that could be taken toward them?
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of protecting people, I talk in the book about the importance for free speech defenders or an organization like PEN to speak out against hateful speech and particularly hate crimes, that if there is a forceful societal response, if we're effective in prosecuting hate crimes, if people in positions of influence speak out and reject bigotry and denigration, I think that helps to protect free speech, and that it allows those who are victimized to feel supported, to feel like they're not alone, and to be able to soldier on, even though it's difficult. And it tamps down the calls to suppress speech, because people feel, well, at least there's a remedy. People have rallied around me, and, this was terrible, but I'm able to persist and endure because I have such widespread support. And so I think all of us have to take an active role in that. When it comes to, should there be punishments for any hateful speech? I think so. And, our harassment laws play a part in that. If people are, overtly racist or sexist in a workplace, in an educational system, we have laws and systems that can allow you to deal with that. The First Amendment is not absolute. And those kinds of comments can interfere with people's access to an equal education, to equal employment opportunity. And so I think that, enforcement of those rules is important.
Yeah, if I can sort of jump in as a point of personal privilege and ask one of my own questions, that riffs off of this, Suzanne. One of the things I kept thinking about was, John Stuart Mill, when I was advocating for civil rights, particularly in the LGBTQ+ context. And just thinking, like, I have the better argument. So if truth contends with error, truth will ultimately prevail, right? So I just felt like, bring it on. Like, I want to have the debate. So say whatever you need to say on your side. I think that the reasonable sort of person in the middle will understand that my arguments are better than the others, right? Again, on pure sort of John Stuart Mill grounds. And I had a student challenge me recently on that and just say, like, in an era of disinformation, are you still so confident about that? So could you just say a little bit more about, the role that disinformation plays in that kind of Millian calculus? Does it sort of upend it, throw a monkey wrench in it, or is a Millian argument still the right one?
Yeah, I mean, I think it really challenges it. And we at PEN America, we've looked at disinformation as a threat to free speech. And, I argue that, if you believe in that function of sort of a marketplace or an open arena for ideas as an environment in which the truth and the best ideas can come to the foreground in this process of debate, if that marketplace becomes so flooded with disinformation that people can't tell the difference between truth and falsehood, and good ideas and bad ideas, the functioning of that marketplace and even the value of free speech is undercut. And I think, we have come close to that as a society. I think we have a segment of society that kind of has gone almost beyond the reach of fact-based, credible information, and is sort of caught in an estuary where it's almost impossible to get through. And so I think we have to own up to that, and that while more speech may be always the better answer when it comes to suppressing speech, it's not a perfect answer, and these formulas don't always work. And I think we have to, as a society, equip ourselves to deal much more affirmatively with disinformation. I think people need to be taught how to evaluate the credibility and veracity of what they're confronting online. We teach children how to analyze a short story, but in a lot of our elementary schools, we're not teaching them how to navigate this roiling ocean of media and information that they're now part of from a very young age. And so I think we have to take an active approach to that and recognize that, at its worst, disinformation can really undercut the value of free speech in society and even the power of open discourse.
Here's someone who's clearly sympathetic to the concept of resilience you're introducing earlier. So do listeners have any obligation not to look to be offended, or at least give others the benefit of the doubt? If so, how does one establish that at an organizational level?
Yeah, I honestly think we'd all be better off if we could try to avoid being offended as easily as I think some in our society are. When I talk about intent and context, I think that's really critical. When you hear something that seems objectionable, to think about, okay, who said it? Is this a peer? Is this someone's grandfather who's from a totally different generation? Is this someone who comes from a different culture where, it might not be fair to expect them to understand how this word is going to land with me? Or is this someone who just seems to be willfully negligent, who's kind of throwing around the N-word as if, they were never put on notice about how objectionable it is. So I think, that's important. We have to be thoughtful and not just react instantaneously. I think one of the challenges in our current environment is that the social media cycles move so quickly that there's this impetus to react instantaneously to something that's objectionable. And that I talk about this in the book. It cuts against looking into and interrogating someone who accused someone else of having a white supremacist symbol and a tattoo, and it kind of went viral. And by the time it was explained to her that no, that's the symbol of a particular military unit, and has a completely innocent meaning, the post had already moved halfway around the world. And so I think for all of us to take a beat to try to understand where the other person is coming from, and consider how to react and where it's going to go from there. Are we going to suppress speech? Are we going to give license to others to suppress speech? And how do we avoid that?
Well, Suzanne, that takes us to time pretty much. And I just want to thank you. I, as you know, come at this more from the equality side than from the free speech side. So I think we have different starting points, but I really found your book to be by far the smartest and best and most thoughtful exegesis of the free speech side of this debate. So I'm so grateful that you took the time to join us today. For everyone, the book one more time is Dare to Speak, Defending Free Speech for All. And the luminary that we have today is Suzanne Nossel. Thanks so much for your time today, Suzanne.
Thank you, Kenji. Congratulations on your book. I look forward to seeing you soon. Thanks, everyone.
Wonderful. We're adjourned. Thank you all.